Hi.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Excited to be here? Yes, this is going to be great. I'm Jack Halberstam, and this is Judith Butler.
I'm Jack Halberstam.
Okay. We have been mistaken for each other in the past, to my advantage, I believe. But, so we're here to have a conversation about this fantastic book, Who's Afraid of Gender, which is making the rounds and creating ripples and conversation, and represents a really interesting return on the part of Judith Butler to issues that they literally were one of the first people to enter into discourse. So it's an interesting way of coming back around. So I'm going to ask some questions. We'll see what kinds of answers come up, and we'll go back and forth and have a bit of a conversation. And when I was reading this book, which, as you know, is preoccupied with the rise of an anti-gender ideology movement around the world that manages to swallow up all kinds of different ideologies and then spew them out into this kind of strange set of accusations that people who believe in gender are trying to destroy the family, they are pedophiles themselves, and so on. But the question that I wanted to begin with, Judith, is not just what it means to oppose this ideology, but what it means to be a kind of icon for the people who believe in that ideology, to be the person that they believe they need to stop. Because you have been a target. I think there was a moment where the Pope mentioned you as a kind of threat. And many of these movements do see you as the author of a version of gender that they come to oppose. So what does it mean not simply to be the author of gender theory, but a negative icon for these right-wingers?
Great, an easy question. First of all, I would say, in fact, that I am an icon for some parts of the anti-gender ideology movement, but not for others. In fact, I don't figure at all. And the Vatican, when it began to elaborate its criticism of the concept of gender and its potentially nefarious influence, identified by name Anne Fausto Sterling, because they were afraid that this feminist biologist was introducing the notion of 5 genders, or that, so the idea that gender could in any way multiply beyond the usual 2 was very worrisome for them for complex reasons having to do with their idea of God creating male and female and God creating the human form in a necessary duality of male and female, right? So there is no human if there is no male and female. If you go beyond that or you go against it, you've destroyed the human, which they claim gender has done. So, but there are parts of the world where I became identified with gender theory, in France, la théorie du genre, and then in parts of Latin America where I was identified as representing gender ideology and a threat to children. My work would indoctrinate them, or my work would license pedophilia, or my work and the work of gender more broadly would teach them how to become homosexual, or teach them that they must become homosexual. Which is
kind of true.
Kind of wild.
Kind of worked, yeah.
Talk about where the wild things are. Well, of course, we know Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick said, yes, we do teach that, you know. And that is one answer, if that is your desire and you're looking for ways to live according to that desire, you know, come along and we'll make that easier for you. but I don't think anybody says this should be your desire, or you have to, that as a group, people who advocate gender policy or teach in gender studies are in favor of indoctrination or unwanted seduction. So, in fact, we spend most of our time criticizing both, including that perpetrated by the church, which has been amply documented. So it's always odd when the church does find evidence of its own crimes in those they wish to persecute.
Right, they're busy. Priests are basically abusing children and then accusing universities of being the place where children
are abused.
Are abused.
Yeah, it's very handy as a projection. But it does operate a little bit like a confession. You know, this is like how priests confess. Yeah. They accuse others of their crime, and then you go, oh, what's in that accusation? You know, that's like a story about you.
But did you feel particularly called upon to make this response to the anti-gender movement, partly because they, in some way, had called you one of the leaders of it, including, you know, burning you in effigy in Sao Paulo? And
yeah, that was fun. I did recognize, I mean, I had already understood from scholars in Hungary and Poland and France and Belgium and elsewhere, certainly in Chile, that the anti-gender ideology movement was making it very difficult for people to teach, making it very difficult to pass and maintain laws that protected gay, lesbian, trans, travesti people against discrimination and violence. But also very difficult to maintain rights of reproductive health and justice, and anti-violence programs more generally. So I did know that it was operating, and I had come across some people, especially in Switzerland and France, who were kind of against me for this reason. But I didn't see the violence of it until I was in Brazil, at which point I did want to reflect more. I've been learning from these scholars for a while and following, but I did think, okay, you're giving me a platform, I'll take the platform. You know, in a way I felt it as a responsibility, but also as a serious quandary for myself. Like, how had gender become this phantasm, this crazy, threatening idea, when in fact, you know, in my experience, it had kind of gone mainstream, and, you know, it wasn't really so interesting, you know, as a mainstream idea. It had been, gender studies has been criticized for separating gender from race, class, you know, disability, ethnicity, colonial frameworks, capitalism. You know, we were all in the academy kind of mixing it up and trying to resituate how we even think about gender in terms of these larger dynamics of power. But the folks on the right were like separating out gender, as they were separating out critical race theory, not necessarily putting them together, not even seeing that black feminists were responsible for most of the innovative theoretical work in critical race theory. Or not understanding what the relationship was between feminism, gender, race, law, justice. So yes, I did feel like it was both enigmatic to me, something I had to figure out better, and also perhaps something of a public responsibility to respond, since they had given me a platform of sorts.
I'm going to ask you in a minute about who your imagined audience is for the book, but I also want to suggest that the fact that many populist and authoritarian movements feel that they need to particularly make trans issues into a central part of their ideology, maybe it suggests that, in fact, the impact of gender studies and sexuality studies has been indoctrination, in the sense that in these conservative homes, many of their children are identifying as gay, as non-binary, as trans. And what they're trying to do is prevent a kind of generational shift that, by the way, has already taken place. So for me, I'm like wondering, I mean, of course the battle is not at all won, because these authoritarian movements are scary in scale and in the way in which they're, you know, really capitalizing on populism at this moment. And yet, I don't know that you can put the genie back into the bottle in relationship to gender variability. So there's a way in which they may be right.
Yes, of course. They are right that we're not going back to their patriarchal wet dream.
Right.
Yeah. And that, you know, binary gender will never be the same again. And they can try as much as they want to make it natural and necessary, and even to have it as a national mandate, as we see in places like Hungary and Russia, and very possibly Italy, as Giorgia Meloni quietly but aggressively advances her agenda. But I think that the reason that this kind of restoration project is underway is precisely because of the success of progressive legislative agendas, the popularity of social movements, and so there is an awareness, and it's not just out there or coming from the urban centers of the global north. It's actually coming from all kinds of places in the world and in different ways. So they're right to worry if what they want is to defend this heteronormative, patriarchal, transphobic, you know, social structure of things, because it has fallen apart. It is falling apart, and that it's never going to return in quite the way they wish it will. But wishing for a return of what cannot return is part of fascist fantasy. And I think we are seeing that in the wave of anti-trans legislation in this country and elsewhere, and the kind of panic or kind of phobic understanding of who trans people are, what threats they pose, what destruction they might wage. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. The right-wing populist reasons are not quite the same as the trans-exclusionary feminists, but they very often participate in the same kind of argumentation. I'm not sure that answered your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it does. I just think there is also a generational component to this, and it's very possible that a generational battle will be waged. You know, I mean, it's no accident that a lot of these politicians, including in the US, are octogenarians, and there's a kind of generational rift. And I imagine that many of the young people who are targeted by these repressive policies are not going to take that gently, you know, that there will be some sort of political response to it. And I wondered whether you have a sense of that. I mean, you do mention movements in Argentina and other places where there are very fierce solidarities between trans feminists, feminist domestic workers, people who are out of work, homeless people, and so on, in solidarity against these repressive regimes.
Yes.
But I think we're also seeing and going to see a wave of youth activism, because so much of these policies are targeted at young people.
Well, I think that's true, especially if we're talking about gender affirmative healthcare in the United States. So depriving young people of the healthcare they need, including psychological services or even school counseling in Texas. I was recently in Austin and spoke to teachers who said that if they try to counsel or secure counseling for young students who are questioning their sex assignment or what their gender might be, that they can actually be prosecuted for harming children. And I also spoke with parents who, if they try to secure health care for their kids who are asking for health care, have been prosecuted. That part is an attack on youth. There is no question about it. But at the same time, I think in different parts of the world, the generational issue plays out differently because, even in a place like Brazil, as terrifying as it was to have that right-wing attack, it also made clear to me, at least in the subsequent couple of years, how many people were involved in gay, lesbian, trans, and travesti affirmative politics, and how it was linked to campaigns against racism and extractivism and hypercapitalism. And so, that was a complex left that was intergenerational that I came to know and who also showed up for me. I wonder how that works globally. To the extent that gender is a concept that harms children or threatens to harm children, trans people will harm your children. Drag queens reading at libraries will harm your children. To the extent that this specter of harm to children reigns, also teachers, right, psychologists, then we have a kind of twin object of attack. On the one hand, it is the kids who are being deprived. They are actually being harmed in the name of being protected from harm because they're not getting what they need. But all of the people who are trying to provide services, who are by definition older, are also like a class that is being prosecuted. So, there are octogenarians that listen and those who don't, right? And I keep hoping that Biden's grandkids will, keep talking to him because I think they know more than he does.
They probably do. Yeah. So who did you think you were writing the book for? I mean, and I don't mean that in a snarky way. I mean, you make a lot of arguments in the book about the way in which the right wing is fairly incoherent and contradictory when it puts together this set of ideas. They tend not to be a logical whole. But at the same time, you suggest that a good argument won't convince them, therefore, that they are in the wrong. And then there are people such as our audience tonight who probably in many ways agree, with the arguments of the book. So who's the audience who might pick up your book and read it and think differently?
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to write a book that was academic, although obviously I can't help but be academic in some regards, and there are a few truly nerdy sentences, but none like in the earlier work. Okay. All right? Don't worry.
Still got it.
Yeah, okay. But I didn't want to be in an echo chamber, just talking to people who already agree with me. I wasn't rallying the troops. And I didn't want to be exclusively academic. So that meant trying to, remember some of the public editorials that I have done and try to hold that voice. With the idea that there are a lot of people kind of in the middle. I can't reach the extreme right wing. I don't think so. It would be nice if I could. I wouldn't mind reaching them and persuading them. But, as I say in the book, some of those folks won't read me, and they won't read you, and they won't read anything that any of us do, because that would be to traffic with the devil, and they're not going to do that. So, or they think they know already what it is and what it does, and they're fixed in their views. But there's a whole group of people in the middle who are intelligent, but who are confused, and who don't know what to think like, oh, they've heard this stuff that gender is, a problem, or stuff is happening in schools, or, their kids or their neighbors are asking to be called by a different pronoun suddenly, and they're stumbling and they don't know how to handle it, right? So kind of, I'm thinking about well-intentioned, intelligent people who might have legitimate confusions about what's going on, and the criticisms they've heard, the maybe the allegations, the accusations, the hype that comes out of, the governors in Florida and Texas, or the hype that comes out of Viktor Orban when he visits CPAC. And they don't know how to sort it. Yeah. So I tried to do something somewhat calm. I guess some people think that was a mistake. I shouldn't be calm. But why not? And just take people through what gender might be and what it might not be. What are the allegations made against it? What's the phantasmatic circuit into which it's been entered? And how do we understand that phantasmatic circuitry? And how do we understand these kind of bad arguments that are made? That gender erases the materiality of the body, that gender is a fiction, it's artificial, that it's, all sorts of notions like that. So I try to take apart what I understood to be the central arguments, not just to show that they're wrong, but to actually try to produce a more even-handed, reflective way of thinking about gender and what's frightening about it.
Yeah. And how hard was it for you to write in that more accessible way? Like, for example, you use the word phantasmatic, which has come up in some of the reviews as still an academic tick that is carried over, when in fact that word is very meaningful, right, in the argument that you're making, because it's part of an irrational fantasy that people have that allows them to lump contradictory material together and believe in it as real.
Exactly. But I mean, it's not as if, one of the problems with the anti-gender ideology movement, as with the movement against critical race theory, or the movement to take the teaching of slavery out of schools, is that they're anti-intellectual, right? They're anti-university, they're anti-intellectual. So it makes no sense for me to pretend not to be an intellectual who has been teaching in universities for several decades. I mean, I am that. But I also speak more broadly, and, I don't speak as an academic in every aspect of my life and my everyday life. I mean, we all switch registers depending on who we're talking to.
You've written about the importance of also retaining a certain level of theoretical density, and difficulty.
True. I thought, and who knows? I may well do that again, and no one will read me, but it's fine.
Not much chance at this point.
but the idea of the phantasmatic. I mean, look, if it were an academic book, I would have gone deep into La Planche, and I would have gone back to Freud's interpretation of dreams, and it's like, then to what extent is an analysis of dream like an analysis of a fantasy, and what did Freud say about daydreaming and fantasy, and where did La Planche get the phantasmatic from? And I could have gone way deep into that stuff, and that would have taken me a long time, and I would have loved it, and I would have gotten all lost, and I would have checked the German and the French, and I would have been really happy. I would have been super happy.
The sexy stuff.
Yeah, but I wasn't so happy because I had to decide, well, what do I need from that concept to show that, okay, this is a scene in which different elements are being played out in relation to one another, sort of like a dream, where we can't just, it's not just my fantasy or your fantasy, but a phantasmatic scene that's being reproduced, in public discourse, in media, in churches, in various religious and secular institutions, in state legislatures. So, I had to be both psycho and social in the way that I thought about it and bring it back to the point, which is something really worrisome is happening in this anti-gender ideology movement, and we need to see that it's linked with an attack on universities, an attack on democracy, and that it's riding a fascist set of passions that support increasingly authoritarian regimes.
So I imagine that, some of your academic readers who come to this book will hear echoes of your early work in it. And one argument that has been really central to the anti-gender movement is the argument that you made in Gender Trouble, that sex is a result of a gender ideology as opposed to sex giving us a foundation for gender. So you reverse the order of the relationship between the body and ideology, and that's the piece that the right-wing Christians in particular, but also the TERFs, are really fixated on, because they want to insist that there is a body, that the body has a real form, and that gender ideology is a distortion of that form. So to me, it was really fascinating to see you go back to, what began it all in some ways, to Gender Trouble.
Well, I went back to Sherry Ortner. I went back to,
you did.
I went way back to the sex-gender distinction and the whole thing.
Yeah. And how, what do you think about that? The fact that 30 years later, we kind of have to have the same argument, and you have to go into a different register and make that argument again, only there are more people who are opposed to it now. And in fact, it's the TERFs, it's the anti-gender people, it's the right-wingers, but even there are some trans theorists who want to say, but Judith Butler, there is a material body. Why are you telling us that everything is created through gender ideology?
Oh, well, I would never, yes, of course, they would use the term gender ideology against me or attribute it to me, I suppose. Scary that feminists would use that term, though, when they see Viktor Orban and Putin and all these intense right-wing anti-feminist authoritarians proliferating that, and including feminism in it, Yeah. They're all anti-feminist. They all want women back in the household, or they want to preserve a not just a binary but a hierarchy. They want sexuality to become exclusively reproductive or mainly so. There are many things going on here that are profoundly anti-feminist. So they're also included as targets of the anti-gender ideology movement, even as they use the language. So that's painful and vexing, and how to speak with them is not easy. Mm-hmm. But look, I think that there are at least 2 points that I would make about the so-called materiality of the body. It's almost like a joke.
It really is. That was Bodies That Matter was already the response.
But you see, then they would say, see, Halberstam and Butler are joking. They don't take it seriously. Okay, but here. Okay. If we just start with sex assignment, right? Like as John Money did. It's like, all right, people are making decisions about how to assign sex. Sex is not just there, it's observed. Sometimes what is observed is complex and not immediately available to binary assignments. Or you make an assignment, and then there's a question of somebody living with that assignment. And when they start to speak and talk and live their lives, they can very well speak up and say, you know what, wrong assignment. This is not the one I want. I'm actually going to assign myself. So when we think about that act of sex assignment, of course, it's material. It's a social act. If we're going to remember Marx, that's a material practice. Sex assignment. It happens in institutions by authorized individuals according to legal documents, which, as we know, are sometimes contradictory, as Paisley Curra has pointed out. Depending on which legal regime you're in, your sex is going to be assigned differently, and maybe even in a contradictory fashion, which is most interesting. So sex assignment is a moment of social power. It's a moment of classificatory power. It doesn't decide once and for all, how best to name that body. It is a provisional assignment that is taken up over time, is lived out, or it fails to be lived out, right? Meets up with queer failure, and some other movement becomes possible. So if we make it into a temporal issue, which it is for all of us, even people who are super happy with their sex assignment, right? Oh yeah, I was assigned female and I'm loving it, right? Sorry, I made that a little gay. It was the only way I could occupy it, It comes back to me through that circuit, Anyway, but seriously, some people are like, yeah, are you still loving it? Yeah, I'm still loving it. In other words, you're still living it out? Yeah, I'm still living it out. You're living it out well? Yeah, I'm living it out really well. So over time, you keep saying yes to the sex assignment you receive. I'm saying yes every day. It's like, okay, still it's a reiterated process. It doesn't happen once, right? Or you get assigned a girl, and you're assigned a girl, and then like the girling, that's one act of girling, and then like starts happening again. Next day. More forms of girling may well be taking place over time, right? So sex assignment is not just punctual. It's like, you're getting assigned every time you walk in. You're getting assigned you walk in here. You're walking someplace. You're assigned all the time. People are, what we might call interpolating you, if we're allowed to still use words like that. So, for me, like, that's material. That determines the material conditions of your life. You could say sex is material in a positivist way, but then why would feminists want to be positivists? This is data, and I don't want to approach this data through any interpretive framework. It's like, well, why? We've been approaching that particular bit of data through an interpretive framework since the beginning of feminism. We've never not. And we certainly are not biological essentialists because, what did de Beauvoir tell us? Biology is not destiny, and remember, we all started breathing more easily. Not because we hate biology, but because we didn't want it to determine how we live and love and work. It's like, thank you very much, I take it with me, it's everywhere where I go. It's not unreal, but doesn't determine me causally in any of these domains of life. Now, a trans person might say, that's not right, and I don't want it, and I want to go back to sex, and I want to inhabit sex, and I want this sex, and I want this sex assignment, and I want this sex to be real, and it's my sex. And I hear that, and I get it, but that's a claim that's being made about, if you're going to say, I claim this sex, you're doing something very powerful with discourse, and you're doing something very real with discourse, and you're establishing and reporting on a reality. But you're not outside of the available discourse. Okay, sorry.
No, but I think, that's what I find confusing, is that the claim for something like a real sex is made across groups who shouldn't necessarily be on the same side of things. And you say as much in the book that to have somebody who calls themselves a feminist making some of the same arguments that are characterizing the anti-gender movement is not just disappointing, but it's quite confusing in terms of the many different ways in which feminism has been articulated. Then when you add to it a potentially trans theory perspective that says also, there is a sex, and I don't have the sex that I want, and that is a material reality, and that is not a gender ideology, that's also another piece of this same claim. And that's...
Well, the sex that I want, the sex that I want, or the sex that I am and that I want, I want recognized, and I want the changes to my body, and I may well want all kinds of transformations of my body, which simply says that this establishment of sex is a process, and it involves technology, it involves possibly surgery, it involves possibly hormones, or it involves legal papers, or it involves any number of social and historical institutions that we want to be able to mobilize for that purpose. Those are all realities. I mean, those are realities that help us to establish the reality of whatever sex it is that we want or that we are. When we talk about reality, we're also talking about social reality. We're talking about institutional realities. We're not just talking about a simple fact that exists apart from the history of categories, the history of naming practices, which doesn't mean that that fact is fake or untrue or unreal, but it's not the only way of thinking about reality. It's not the only measure of reality. I mean, if we're social theorists, or even if we're literary theorists, we want to be able to say oppressive structures are real. We want to be able to say that, forms of desire are real. We want to talk about reality in a much broader way than in a positivist framework, or in a framework that returns us to biological causality. So I worry that sometimes these so-called debates are not debates. They're a set of assertions that are meant to interrupt reflection and thought, but they're not necessarily thoughtful arguments. And then we have to ask what that declarative moment is that just seeks to assert things as true, rather than interrogate the conditions under which we are able to say what is true, or we want to be able to say what is true, or truths we want to be able to say that we've not been able to say. What are the conditions for that? We live in history. Okay, sorry, carrying on.
No,
carrying on.
Is fantastic.
Okay.
I'll ask one more kind of specific question like that, and then we can get into maybe a more general question. Then we'll see where we're at. At some point in the book, you
Thank you for doing this, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
No. Look at you're so it's very generous. You did all these questions, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
This is fun. This is really fun,
people
right?
Think, but people. Well, okay.
So, and you actually, I feel this book, you give a lot of yourself. I mean, that's why I began with that question. Like, this is a very generous book. It's like you're using your rigorous intellect to make sense of this very confusing moment that we're in, this very confusing and contradictory set of claims that are being made about the body and that are being used really against some of the most vulnerable people in the society. So I feel like it is a generous and a generative book. And you do say at one point, I think you come out in the book as non-binary, and I wanted to ask you, before we go into some of the architecture of the book, like, what about this category of non-binary? What did it mean to you to be able to come out as non-binary? And what do you think of some of the claims that are now being made in academia about non-binary, that it is the neoliberal category, where people just get to claim whatever they want about themselves, and that non-binary is a category that is, loose and baggy in a certain way, or liberal, God forbid, right?
Okay. Wow.
Because you didn't come out and say, oh, I'm trans, or I'm this kind of butch. You said you decided to go with non-binary.
Yes. Non-binary came to me, I would say, because, all these young people I mean, at the end of Gender Trouble, I call for, in a way, the proliferation of gender beyond the binary. But I didn't really know how to do that. It was just like, all right, let's go. Let's see what happens.
It worked.
No, but it was like it was an open call in a way, or like, why couldn't that be, or why wouldn't we do that, right? So many years later, 35, if we're going to say when I actually wrote that book, there are all these categories and all these young people experimenting and coining and changing, and of course, almost everybody is young now. So when I say young people, I mean,
Everybody else.
Anybody younger than
Who's not
65, But no, they were, and I saw that, and I thought, well, I think I have a permanent disidentification with categories, and that's one thing that queer was describing for me, was a disidentification. I mean, which doesn't mean I can't operate within them. I do. I had to show up as a parent for my kid, and sometimes that meant being a mother, and sometimes it meant being a parent, or whatever. I mean, feminist events, as women, I can do it. But I never, occupied a category like, yeah, this is me, oddly, I would say that's true about gender categories, okay? I think, oddly enough, for me, being Jewish is absolutely unquestionable. It's really rough right now, but it is unquestionable. And it's just a different order of things, and I'm not sure I know how to understand that, but I stand inside that category and rail from there. Yeah, okay. Different topic.
Do you want to go there?
No, we're still on this one. When it became clear to me that it was legally possible in the county where I live in California, it was just nonsensical for me not to be non-binary, because it actually named, in some ways, my kind of disidentification with category itself. Now, that's not going to be very satisfying to people who want it to be something more substantial than that. So I don't have an elaborate theory of non-binary categorization. I don't. I just thought, great, I have always been neither this nor that, and I don't know exactly how I live without a firm identification in the way that many people have, but I seem to do fine. And it's not that by entering into that category, I'm now claimed by it and that's my identity. It's actually my way of living out disidentification. And I don't think for many people that works politically, and it's not going to be satisfying as a phenomenological description. So, yeah, maybe that's where I'm not so useful for a bunch of folk. I don't think it's neoliberal, because I accept the interpolations when they happen, whether that's, no matter, how it works. So, but and I think it doesn't stop me from having solidarity. Right. It just, I'm not representing like a huge class of people when I speak.
I mean, I like that idea that it is a place accessed through disidentification, because of course for me anyway, the emphasis on non-binary is in the non. It's not a claim made on something; it's a claim that's not being made on something, and that refusal is kind of powerful. It's powerful enough that it's appealing to massive numbers of young people, which in many ways is at least one of the sources of anxiety in this country about some kind of gender ideology that they're worried about. So I mean, I think it's a very useful category.
Maybe. I'm not sure I would recommend my way of doing things. I mean, it's not like I think, oh, other people should do as I'm doing. I don't feel that way. I just feel like this is the only way I know how to do it. So it's, it's...
Well, we could have a conversation at some point about that, because to me it might be generational in the sense that, we're not of the age where trans was widely available when we were young.
True.
Yeah. Where it could have gone a very different way, if when you were 16, there was actually a gender clinic down the road.
Yes, I think it would have gone a different way.
Yeah, ditto. Yeah. So we will move towards the question part, but when you're reading this book, it isn't all just bad news. I mean, there is. Right, the book makes a very compelling case about the threat posed by anti-gender ideology as it's expressed in many different forms, but there's also a way in which you're arguing for some other outcome, for another possibility that comes to us through solidarity and delivers some kind of, and you use this word a lot in the book, some kind of freedom. And I wanted to ask you about the category of freedom, because the category of freedom is also a very vexed category in, theories of power, because freedom can so easily be used also to, swallow people up into a kind of neoliberal fantasy of what's possible. So, the book ends with the claim, what if we make freedom into the air we breathe together? What do you mean by freedom in the book?
Well, the book doesn't exactly have like a theory of freedom. There are other people in my household who actually do have theories of freedom. But I would say that at a minimal level, I ask the question time and again, what it would mean to live free of the fear of violence, pathologization, or criminalization for many people and for many different groups of people. And especially in my appeal to trans-exclusionary feminists, I remind them that they too want to live in a way that allows them to walk the streets at night or to be able to be in an educational environment or a site of employment without harassment, discrimination, and violence. So to be free of violence, discrimination, pathologization, criminalization is one sense of freedom that I seek recourse to, mainly to persuade others that their goals in life are actually very much in sync with the goals that some of their apparent enemies have. It makes sense that in so many Latin American feminist movements, there is an opposition to femicide, feminicide. Trans women are included in that second notion, but also against violence against travestis and trans people, that the same groups of people, the same institutional structures that wage violence against one group also wage against the others. What would it mean to only oppose violence that's done against one group and not against another? So I'm trying to actually foster an idea of equality. Like, why would we be part of a social movement that fights discrimination of one kind while conducting discrimination of another? That's contradictory. And it's not just that we want to live without contradictions, but that we want to expand our idea of equality. Who is equally entitled to live in this free way I am trying to describe, to have access to that freedom. And this means looking at freedom not just as an individual liberty or a personal liberty, but really as a collective obligation. And it also puts freedom and equality together, but only really in a sketchy way, because my aim is not to offer a philosophical treatise on these topics, but to persuade people to enter into solidarities even when they feel quite antagonistic towards those who are suffering in similar ways, or they can't always bridge the gap between their own experience and the experience of another. So, I want us to go back to that idea, since I think the stakes are very high. I guess there's another thing to say here, which is, some people on the left will say, oh, gender, sexuality, race, these are all identity categories, and they're fragmenting the left, and we need to go back to larger frameworks, etc. And sometimes there are identitarian struggles or debates that are pretty fragmenting. So I wouldn't doubt that. On the other hand, it seems to me that when you say something like the movement for Black lives, oh, that's about identity. It's like, well, I thought it was about justice. I thought it was about equality. I thought it was about freedom. I thought it was about redefining what we mean by democracy. Or, oh, feminism, that's just about women's interests. It's like, I think maybe it was about autonomy and freedom and equality and justice, and that too was a challenge to our rather limited ideas of what democracy might be. So now that we see quite clearly that the right-wing anti-gender ideology movement is attacking democracy, universities, education down the line, we have to accept that the whipping people into a frenzy about gender, to the point where they're willing to strip trans people of their legal rights or deprive kids of their right to health care, or take away parental rights for gay and lesbian people, or refuse parenting rights to trans people or to single mothers. I mean, all of these propositions are now being considered throughout Eastern Europe, throughout different very right-wing organizations, and the World Congress on the Family, and CPAC itself. So anti-gender ideology is an attack on democracy, which is why we need to be able to think about gender. We need to be able to think about race, especially the astonishing attack on African American studies, on ethnic studies, on the teaching of slavery. We need to think about all these things, not as identity problems, but as fundamental questions of democracy, because democracy is being threatened through these means. These are some of the means, not the only means, but certainly these are among the central means, and they're among the most emotional and persuasive for the right. So Trump keeps kind of changing. It's like, should it be the anti-trans discourse of DeSantis, or should it be like, oh, migrants are toxic, they're toxifying the blood of the country, right? Oh, yeah, let's do the anti-migrant one. But whatever it is, it's like spurring these kinds of fears and hatreds, to which I do call fascist passions, to support radically anti-democratic political movements, which, if elected and installed, do represent a massive threat to democracy. Maybe, I was going to say, as we have known it, or as we have wished it, or as we still wish for it. Okay, sorry.
Random interjection, but I remember years ago when you and I, we both happened to be at an event where the great Leslie Feinberg was speaking. Yes. And, whenever in the book, when you talk about solidarity, I think about Leslie on the stump for the 20-odd years that they went around and gave talks. And, democracy was not really the goal for Feinberg. It was a very particular form of socialism. Yes. And I'm wondering whether we can get where you want us to go through democracy at this point.
Yeah, people do ask me that. Yeah. Like, it's not a revolutionary horizon. But I think I do think there's an idea of radical democracy, and again, I'm not writing a tract in political philosophy here, but I think there is an idea of radical democracy that absolutely includes socialism centrally. But, I loved Feinberg because, he made, what do we say?
They?
They.
Her.
Yeah, okay.
I think there was her.
Oh,
Remember
one of
there
those,
was that.
HIR.
Yeah. But I don't know what the
Speak to
pronouns
us, Leslie. No, but what was so fabulous about Leslie Feinberg is that Feinberg made Marxism into a butch issue.
Yeah. How are we doing for time, Camilla?
We've got a lot of questions rolling in.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. I mean, just so you know, I did have a question about liberals, whether, Andrea Long Chu recently wrote a piece that said, well, I'm at the moment, I'm less worried about TERFs and I'm more worried about TALs.
Yeah.
And TALs are trans-agnostic reactionary liberals of the kind who write about trans issues in the New York Times on a regular basis and say, oh, these people are going too far and they're not letting us say what we want to say, and the woke culture is censoring us.
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
You know what? Well, what's ironic is that those are the people to whom I wanted to be writing.
Exactly.
That's my audience.
Yeah.
So I didn't name it, and Andrea would be right to mark that, but that was my idea.
That's what I wanted to make clear. And then the only other question I really have, and you can just pass on this one, there are people like Paul Preciado who are like, we're kind of done with psychoanalysis. That is not going to allow us to explain to each other what's going on now, nor take us to a place where we can effectively oppose it. And I was wondering whether you feel there are other symbolic languages that we can use outside of some of that now archaic language that was describing a very different time than ours. And I know this is just like all the questions you ever wanted to ask Judith Butler, but we're afraid to ask. I'm doing that, but just roll with it.
No, but what I'm enjoying, and one reason I'm smiling, is that the two of us have been having this conversation for several decades, so it's great to have it again. Are we done with psychoanalysis? It seems to me, are we done with psychoanalysis is a really important psychoanalytic question. Some would say it's an interminable... okay, sorry, yeah.
You can leave it there.
That was the quick way out. No, look, psychoanalysis is, I think it's still important. Like when I look at when I was trying to understand the fantasy structure, like how do these people say gender is hypercapitalism, right? Or gender is colonization, kind of taking a left, anti-colonial position and making it into a right-wing one. Or gender is Marxism, or gender is totalitarianism. And they say it all, like within a space of a few minutes. Like, how do they hold that together? It would be one thing to be just like a good, arrogant, secular academic and say, look at the contradictions, and then be done with it. It's another thing to say, how does the mind hold that together in that way? And why is it holding it in that way? For me, that is both a psychoanalytic question, but also a social and historical one. And the reason I call this book a psychosocial study is that I'm actually trying to look at the historically specific ways that this phantasmatic structure is articulated. So I don't accept, for this kind of analysis, a psychoanalysis that would separate the analysis of the psyche from the analysis of history. I'm actually trying to appropriate and misuse a psychoanalytic concept that Laplanche would not have liked. He would not have liked what I'm doing with it. And I know this because I met him and he has
told you that.
Well, he liked certain things and he didn't like others and he let me know. Okay. But, it's an appropriation and misuse for the purposes of an illumination that allows psychoanalysis to live, perhaps, in historical and political discourse in a way that it doesn't always do. And be changed by it. Okay.
That's a method.
All right, questions from the audience. Has the way that you theorize the possibility and mechanisms of cultural change been altered or been affirmed through your thinking through the massive generational changes in gender identification between Gender Trouble's publication and now?
Well, everything has changed since then. Yes, of course, everything has changed, and I'm constantly learning and revising. And I obviously would not write Gender Trouble again in that way with those sentences now. No, seriously, I would not have made the same argument. And I've learned a lot from the good criticisms, and there have been many actually excellent criticisms. Yes, I wouldn't be able to detail thoroughly all the ways my views have changed, but I think that I would say they are substantial. I do revisit certain concepts, like, oh, what do I think about performativity now, or how would I have made that more clear? How would I restage it, you know? And I do a little bit of that in this book, but not a lot, because I knew some people would be expecting like more on that, but because I'd become over-identified with that. But some things I let go, you know. Anyway, that would be like a whole new book to explain that difference. But yeah,
Maybe we'll get that book one day.
okay. I don't think so. I think we're winding down now. Yeah.
So there's several questions about freedom and how gender manifests globally, but I'll start with this one, and maybe we'll get deeper into this depending how things go. So what about the weaponization of, quote, gender freedoms, unquote, by the U.S. imperialist project in the information/ideology part of the various, quote, West versus East wars we're involved in, which can look different in a justice point of view in terms of Ukraine versus Palestine or other places?
Well, I think we've seen the way feminism and so-called gender freedoms have been mobilized by forms of, cultural imperialism, but also the imperialist or culturally arrogant use of human rights discourse. And feminism has been used to wage wars, and we know this. So it's one reason I was confused by the right-wing attack on gender, because I thought the problem was the mainstreaming of gender and the way in which it was being instrumentalized by Western countries, funders, foundations, to impose colonial agendas or even to wage wars. So we've seen how that works. We're going to liberate the Afghan women. We're going to destroy Palestine and caricature Palestine as a place where women, gay, lesbian, trans people don't live freely or openly. We're going to use a selective record on human rights to pinkwash the terrible human rights violations committed by the State of Israel. Indeed, the crimes committed by the State of Israel can't actually be described just through a list of human rights violations. We'd have to go back to colonization and apartheid and state racism to capture all that happens there. But so I know those arguments, and I have actually supported those arguments for a long time. What is peculiar to me, which is why opposing the anti-gender ideology movement does not mean we suddenly become pro-gender, like in all its forms or all the ways in which it's used. No, that's not the point. That's not the point. But what was very confusing was to see the appropriation of certain left anti-colonial arguments by the right, so that the Vatican would say, for instance, that gender is colonizing, gender ideology is colonizing the poor in Latin America. It's being exported from global from the global north, that it is cultural imperialism. And at first you think, oh, wow, sounds like liberation theology is informing him. Sounds like he's been reading, Joseph Massad and Jasbir Puar and, a whole bunch of folk. And it's like, no, I don't think so. That's not his argument, because what he really wants is for the Christian missionary aim to establish the heteronormative family based on binary gender. He wants to establish that throughout Latin America. So if that's his aim, then he actually has a colonial mission of his own, but he's imposing it or calling for its restoration through the appropriation of an anti-colonial critique. And here, you have to kind of listen carefully, because there's, what Naomi Klein has called a kind of doppelganger effect, where what seems like a left argument is being mobilized, a left argument against colonization is being mobilized by a right-wing Christian nationalist position that is seeking to restore the colonial organization of gender. So there's a whole part of this book in which I actually look at some work in decolonial feminism and in relationship to the concept of gender, to understand how we are to distinguish between a decolonial critique of gender and even the cultural arrogance of gender, and the limits of gender as a category that doesn't work in every language, and the right-wing appropriation of an anti-colonial critique in order to reinstall its own colonial order. And it took me a long time to understand it, I have to say, but I think my distinctions are pretty clear. Also, there's a whole chapter on translation and monolingualism, cautioning against monolingualism and the hegemony of English in so many of these debates, where I try to lay out that what we sometimes call gender, meaning gender identity, or gender as one way of organizing society, or a power relation within society, that term doesn't work in every language, that it meets its limits, and that there are other vocabularies and other frameworks. So we need to live in a multilingual world, and we need to accept translation as a precondition of any kind of feminist, gay, lesbian, trans, whatever, inquiry in politics. So I am not re-centralizing gender in that politics. I'm actually asking for it to be rethought through a different kind of, I would say, anti-colonial and multilingual lens.
So we have a couple slightly more personal questions, and they're interrelated, so I'll give them both at the same time. Do you have any words of advice for people who are stigmatized for being non-binary, both within and outside of queer communities? And then the related question, as a young trans person, 20, how responsible am I to educate those around me? And this person has another follow-up. Also, how can I get noticed by the Pope? So the first one was about being non-binary and how that can be a struggle both within and outside of queer communities, and if you have any advice around that.
Well, I don't know how to give advice because, I hear from young people about this, but I'm not, at my age and in my worlds, I'm not exposed to it in the same way. But I am listening, and I find it really lamentable that in this world in which we're all being targeted as, or we're made to be much more vulnerable and precarious and understand ourselves to be targets, that we would be fighting with each other over this kind of nomenclature. I think we're all exploring language and seeing what it can do for us, and sometimes a category is really livable for one person and absolutely not for another. And then we look over and we say, well, why aren't you in my category? Or why is that livable for you and it's not for me? It's like, well, guess what, there are a lot of different ways of living in language and finding language livable, that is to say, supportive of the life you're trying to live. So I think we need to give each other a little more space and freedom. And we also need to just ask for that, like, get off my back. So, and I'm sad by those kinds of struggles. I don't understand them, but I think maybe sometimes we need to have somebody be the same as us, or to identify in the same way, or this is the only way it is legitimate to identify. And then we're lost, I think, when we go down that pathway, because we're forgetting that we actually need forms of solidarity and mutual understanding that accept difference as fundamental, and we need to learn more about difference. Maybe listen a bit more carefully and patiently. I don't think we should spend all of our time educating others. And I think, especially for a young trans person who's got to answer a lot of questions, like, have a reading list, tell people to do some reading.
YouTube.
See some excellent videos, see some excellent films, do some research on their own, and then come back and have a conversation. But, you can't be educating people all the time. I don't know. How do you answer that? You should answer that.
No, I would say, first of all, you're not really trying to give advice in this book. I mean, the book isn't written to give advice on how to be trans or be non-binary and not struggle. I mean, struggle is there. I think it's more important to understand how these categories are located in some of these antagonisms that are being played out on a global scale. I think probably neither one of us are people to ask for advice from. That's what I would say.
I would ask you for advice. I don't know.
I don't take it.
I have asked you for advice, and you have given it to me.
So thinking about difference again, we've got some TERF questions. So we've seen TERF campaigners now who seem to be the intellectual anti-trans movement and use LGBTQ plus symbols for their own purposes. Take Kathleen Stock in the UK, who identifies as queer but is anti-trans and works at the university level, and therefore gives more credence to the conservative cause. How do we respond to these very visible and partially aligned figures?
Well, you've done that in the book.
I tried to do that in the book. I consider some of Kathleen Stock's views and other trans-exclusionary feminists. I don't call them gender critical as they wish, because they are not critical in any way that I understand critical theory or critical thinking. And I'm going to keep that word, and they can't have it. So anyway, it's really easy to yell and scream. And there has been so much invective volleyed back and forth, right? And especially in the UK, it's very intense. There's a lot of hateful discourse circulating on all sides, and I was trying to understand what it is that the trans-exclusionary feminists fear. They don't like my asking that question sometimes. They think I'm psychologizing, but they do say that they fear that their identity is being appropriated. They fear that they will be violated by someone in disguise. They fear that feminism or lesbianism will be relegated to an inferior position. And I guess I want to ask whether those fears, as deeply as they're felt, and they clearly are founded on something that's actually real, or whether there's a kind, and I am willing to say real all the time, but, whether there is a kind of projection and misunderstanding of what trans life is all about and what trans people are trying to secure for themselves. don't know exactly how an understanding might ever be reached. I mean, maybe these are just deep, impossible rifts. But I think it is worth trying to understand what people are saying, especially when trans-exclusionary people fail to or refuse to recognize trans people by their names or their pronouns, or accept their self-identification or self-determination. It seems to me that they are effacing the identities, the existence of those from whom they withdraw language of recognition. So we have effacement on the one hand, and then we have appropriation violation on the other. These are all claims about being harmed in deep and abiding ways, and I don't know what kind of conversation could take place, but it would have to be one that would start perhaps by identifying those basic elements and then finding a way to live together in a world in which none of those harms are actually taking place, where those who are harming cease to harm, and those who are figured as harming can be recognized as just trying to live. Now, I don't know how that could be achieved, but I'm pretty sure not through screaming. Yeah.
So there's so many amazing questions, and we can't get to them all, but I just want to end on this one. Given the wide range of criminalization that is currently underway and the distortions that we're living through in relation to quote-unquote truth, and the backlash in places that once were hopeful, Argentina, for instance, increased fascism and the massive hoarding of resources by a few, where do you find potentiality right now in an increasingly fragmented and dispossessed world?
Do you think we could open that to the audience and see where people are finding it? Because I would like to hear. I don't really know. That is such a huge question. I mean, I do think there are brave and underfunded social movements. There's still a million people that took over the streets of Buenos Aires after Milei's election. There are amazing forms of solidarity among environmentalists, among queer people fighting for racial justice, among people standing up for Palestine, among anti-racist and anti-racist movements and movements in support of the rights of migrants.
Abolitionists.
There are abolitionists who are forcing us or compelling us to imagine in new ways. I think poetry is really important right now. I think people are reading poetry and they care about art. They want their world to be recast in other forms, scents, and colors. I think networks of care and solidarity are enormously important. And I think efforts to renew socialist ideals are also crucial, but maybe this time without the patriarchal hold. That would be good. I'm sorry that I don't have something inspirational to say at this moment, but...
I think you just did.
Did I? Okay.
Yeah. And I think, on behalf of everybody here, Judith, I would just like to say thank you so much for your work, for your generosity, and for being fearless. Thank you.